Good evening and a very warm welcome to tonight's book launch. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you on this special occasion, the presentation of my new book titled Reframing Providence, New Perspectives from Aquinas on the Divine Action Debate, published in January by Oxford University Press. I would also like to welcome in particular Father Mariusz Tabaczek, who kindly agreed to review my book this evening. Father Mariusz Tabaczek is a Polish Dominican and theologian. He holds a PhD in philosophical theology from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Since 2020, Father Tabaczek has been professor of theology and philosophy at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, the Angelicum, and is also a member of the Thomistic Institute there. He's an expert in the science and theology dialogue, has published numerous papers on a wide range of topics in the field, and is the author of two recent monographs, Emergence Towards a New Metaphysics and Philosophy of Science with the University of Notre Dame Press in 2019, and Divine Action and Emergence, an Alternative to Panentheism, also with University of Notre Dame Press in 2021. This year we'll see the publication of his much anticipated third monograph, Theistic Evolution, a Contemporary Aristotelian Perspective, with Cambridge University Press. The evening will be structured as follows. First, I will outline the context of the book. Then Father Mariusz Tabaczek will take over and present a critical assessment of the book, to which I will briefly respond. After about 45 minutes, we will start the Q&A session. So, the title of my book is Reframing Providence, New Perspectives from Aquinas on the Divine Action Debate, and as you can guess, the book is on the Divine Action Debate. The Divine Action Debate is a debate that started in the 1950s, early 1960s, and is about the nature and possibility of divine action in light of modern science. And in the book, I argue that there are two essential presuppositions of that debate. The first being that providence is best conceptualized in terms of divine action, and the second, that divine action is best modeled on human action. So we see that the idea is that if we want to understand the doctrine of providence, that what we have to do is first come to terms with the concept of action. So you go into the philosophy of action and develop a robust understanding of what it means to act in the human realm. And then you apply that model or that notion of action to God. So you model divine action on human action. That's the second premise. And the first premise then is that once you have understood what divine action is, you have thereby also solved kind of all issues concerning, or most issues concerning God's providence. So let's look at the reasons why these two presuppositions are so widely shared in the debate. I'd start with assumption one, namely that providence is best conceptualized in terms of divine action. The divine action debate was a response to the so-called biblical theology movement, and one of its key proponents is George Ernest Wright. And he states that the central message of the Bible is a proclamation of divine action. So the idea is that the Bible is not so much the word of God, but rather the divine, all about the divine deeds. So if you will, if you have to summarize the Bible in two words, it would be divine action. Now, this movement has been criticized for various reasons, and with this criticism also comes a criticism of the concept of divine action. And the Divine Action Project, which you see here on the slide, basically is an attempt to re-establish a robust notion of divine action in light of that criticism. This project is a massive 25-year project hosted by the Vatican Observatory in Rome and the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley. So it's a joint venture. And one of the founding fathers of that project, Robert Russell, states the following: the problem of divine action lies at the heart of the doctrine of providence. So the idea is that once you come to terms with divine action, you then also understand what providence is. And if that is the case, then all we have to do is basically see what the challenge in light of modern science is, the challenge concerning providence, solve that challenge, and then we have a robust understanding of what divine providence is. So here on the slide you see the formalization of what they took to be the main challenge back at the start of the project. Namely, first premise, causally determined systems preclude Oster. Oster is for now just divine action in the world. I'll say more about it in a minute. Second premise, nature is a causally determined system, and if that is the case, then nature precludes Oster. So the idea is that if the world turns out to be a causally determined system, a system that is exhaustively describable in terms of natural causes, then there is no room for divine action, no room for God to act in the world. And so basically then the task is to make room for God to act. Now, I'll come back to this challenge, but before I do so, we need to introduce some terminology. So the standard terminology includes a distinction between, on the one hand, general divine action, and on the other hand, special divine action. To cut a long story short, general divine action is creation and generation, that is, the giving of existence to things and the upholding of things in existence. And special divine action is a divine action that goes beyond that. And it can be special in at least three senses. The first one is called subjective special divine action, and that is all about the human response to a given event. The second one is called functional special divine action, and that's about the role that a certain event plays in the overall purpose of God. So if that event in a special way furthers the purpose of God, then we can call it special in a functional sense. Now, the Divine Action Project wanted to establish special divine action in a third sense, namely the category of objective special divine action. And that can be defined as follows. A divine action is objectively special if first it goes beyond creation and conservation, that is to say, if it goes beyond general divine action. If it, secondly, involves not only final causation or intentionality, but also efficient causation. If it, thirdly, is neither merely a human response to an event, subjective special divine action, nor simply serves as a special function in furthering God's purpose, functional special divine action, and where furthermore, fourth, the effects are particular here and now rather than uniform. So the idea is that if God acts objectively in the world, then we need to see and measure or somehow determine the effect, and it needs to be a particular effect here and now. And what God does needs to be at least more than Him creating and conserving that effect. So that's the first point, namely objective special divine action. And now comes a second conceptual link, and this is the alleged breakthrough of the special divine action project. So the single most important outcome of that whole 25-year project is called NIODA. Now, NIODA stands for non-interventionist objective special divine action, which is basically a pairing of the kind of divine action I've just talked about, namely objective special divine action, and the idea of non-interventionism. Why is this important? Because there was a debate in Protestant theology between so-called liberals and conservatives. And the liberals held the view that God acts specially in the world, but only in a subjective or functional sense. So there is no problem there because it's simply subjective or functional, and there is no intervention going on at all. The conservatives, on the other hand, held that we need a more robust understanding of of divine action, namely objective special divine action, but they were fine with these special divine acts being interventions. Now, interventions here has a very particular meaning, namely in the human sense, a violation of the laws of nature. So the idea is that if God acts objectively, he always and by necessity violates or at least suspends a law of nature. And that is something that the science and religion scholars that conducted this program or this project didn't accept, because they wanted to get in dialogue with the sciences, and so having a concept of divine action that violates the laws of nature that the scientists describe was a non-starter. And so the project then said, well, this is not a problem because we can decouple the two. Namely, we can have objective special divine action and yet non-interventionist, of a non-interventionist nature. So Robert Russell writes, you have it on the slide, NIODA combines the virtue of the liberal approach, non-interventionism, so no violation of the laws of nature, and the conservative approach, objective divine action, without the corresponding disadvantages. And in light of this, we can come back to the original challenge. So the response to this original challenge is simply to deny the second premise, to say that nature is not a causally determined system. And if nature turns out to be causally indeterministic, then we can't conclude that it precludes Oster. And so then the idea emerged that causal indeterminism is somehow provides the room or space or loophole for God to act. Now, I don't have anything against the negation of the second premise. In fact, I do believe that nature is causally indeterminate. What I take issue in my book is the implicit assumption of the first premise, namely that causally determined systems preclude Oster. Why? Because I think it's theologically wanting to understand divine causation and creaturely causation or natural causation at the same level. That is to say, in a zero-sum perspective, where the more God does, the less there is for creatures to do, and the more creatures do, the less there is for God to do. And that is implicitly presumed in this first premise, I argue, in the book. So I started off by saying that there are two general presuppositions of the debate. The first one, that providence is best conceptualized in terms of divine action, and second, that divine action is best modeled on human action. And this second premise, I think, is the underlying reason for this first premise. So analyzing that second presupposition shows why they end up with this, what I call theophysical incompatibilist premise. What I call here theophysical incompatibilism is the assumption that just as human libertarian free action presupposes causal indeterminism, the thesis that some events are not fully determined by antecedent causes, so too divine action in the world presupposes causal indeterminism. So the reasoning behind this position is fairly straightforward. In the philosophy of action, there's a common position called incompatibilism, or libertarian position, which basically states that if the world is causally determined, then we cannot act freely. And if you take that understanding of human action and apply it univocally to God, then you might end up with a view according to which God cannot act either if nature is causally determined. And thereby you make causal indeterminism the condition of possibility of divine action. In other words, if the world is causally determined, then there is no space, no room for God to act, and only if nature is causally indeterminate can God act. I'll illustrate this with an example. So think of the world like a cheese block. And so if the world looks like this wheel of cheese, where all is already filled with cheese, then you might think that God has no room in that cheese world to act. He might process the cheese in the first instance, but once the cheese is there, there's no way he can act in it. But what if the world looks rather like a Swiss cheese with many holes in it, right? Then it's still the case that God can't act in the cheese, but at least he can act in the holes. And so the more holes you have, the better for God, because he can act in these holes, in these eyes. And these eyes are what the Divine Action Project calls causal gaps or causal indeterminism. So the idea is that causal indeterminism is a lack of causation, of natural causation, and so these holes can be filled by divine action. So the problem is solved by simply assuming that the world looks like this and not like this. So why do I think that this is a non-starter? So as I said, the idea here is that God and creatures are competing for space. So it's like here you have a basket of a fruit basket, and it's full. So if you want to put here in oranges, you have to take something out, say the bananas. So if I wanted to put in 3 oranges, I have to take out 2 bananas. And according to the same logic, if that logic is applied to God and creature, then you have to say something like, well, if God wants to be present in this room, we have to vacate the room, because otherwise there's no space for him. And so when we apply this to causation, then the idea is that we have to somehow limit either divine action or creaturely action, because they compete for space. And this is, I think, a non-starter, and is what Karl Rahner expressed in the axiom of direct and not inverse proportionality. So the more God acts, the more the creature acts, and this is directly the inverse proportionality from what we find in inner-worldly relations, because there it's the case that the more you do, the less there is for me to do, and vice versa. Okay, now if that is the case, that there's something fundamentally wrong about the way this whole project and was set up and the divine action debate is framed, then perhaps it's good to revisit these premises. And in the book, I suggest that we should look at the second premise, but we should especially look at the first premise, because it might turn out that divine action or action concepts isn't the best starting point in the first place. And so basically, I go back into the history of providence and show that there are 2 different approaches to the doctrine of providence. One, which I call actionistic providence, which basically says that providence is essentially divine action in the world. So the analogy here is action, and that is the prevalent framing of the debate. And in the book, I argued that there is a second approach to be explored, which says that providence is essentially about the ordering of creatures to an end. And the analogy here is not action, and certainly not human action, but the virtue of prudence. And prudence is related to action, but it's not the same as action. It's about ordering means to an end, and ordering actions to an end, finding the right means. And so this is a deeply teleological notion, and so in the book, I suggest that it might be worth to reframe providence, namely in a teleological manner. And now I'll hand over to Father Mariusz Tabaczek.
So first of all, Dr. Kopf, thank you very much for first inviting me to review the book. It was a pleasure to read it. Also, I mean, first of all, maybe because it falls into my area of research, but also it is important. It is a great read. Simply, it's a very well-written, well-researched project. So my task, and thank you for inviting me, obviously, here to speak in front of all of you. So So it happens that I studied in Berkeley, and I know many people who were engaged in the Divine Action project. So first of all, trying to situate this project that Dr. Kopf presents us with. So because the project was run by Robert John Russell, who is a Protestant theologian, but Catholics in one way or the other were engaged in this project. So the first, I should say, participation in and response to comes from William Steger, who was unfortunately, he died recently, several years ago at a young age. He was a physicist working in the Vatican Observatory, and he's oftentimes forgotten slightly, at least, because he does not quote Thomas Aquinas hardly ever, but he is deeply entrenched in the classical Aristotelian Thomistic theology, and especially those contributions that are listed here from 1993, 5, and 8, where he speaks about the status of the laws of nature, then in 95 on primary and secondary causation, and in 1998 on teleology in evolution. So he does this from the point of view of a physicist and cosmologist, but those thoughts are deeply motivated and influenced by Aquinas and Aristotle. So this is a first, we may say, indirect, at least, and preliminary response. The second one comes from Nicanor Austriaco, a Dominican who is a biologist, who writes a paper in 2003 on double agency in evolution. So he's trying to defend the classical notion of causation and apply it in evolution. Then William Carroll, he has written many papers on science and religion, but particularly this one from 2008 on divine agency in contemporary physics, which is relevant to Divine Action Project. And then we have three more developed and extensive responses. The first coming from my advisor, Michael Dodds, who teaches in Berkeley, and he writes his Unlocking Divine Action. So this is a book-length response to the entire project. Then there is, I believe, my book that comes in 2021, where I specifically deal with one particular model of NIODA, which I will list in a minute. And then we have last year published book by Ignacio Silva that Dr. Kopf studied with. So he is coming or joining us in this debate and conversation with particularly interesting contribution which he presents us with in his book. So first, what are the advantages or strong sides of the book? Basically, I agree with the entire argument, as you can imagine, but particularly important, I think, is the first part of the book, which presents us with clearly structured, lucid, and formalized, and this is very important, response and criticism of those presuppositions and the core ideas of Divine Action Project, specifically this concept of NIODA. Now, this NIODA can be and is defined by scientists who are engaged in this project with reference or in reference to three types of causation. The first one is top-down or whole-part causation. And here, NIODA is being seen as God's action on the totality of the universe without being engaged in details, in a way. So this is something that I deal with in my book, specifically with this model of divine action discussed in this project. Then we have a lateral causation-based version of NIODA, which refers to the theory of chaos in physics, developed by John Polkinghorne. And then the last one, probably the most important and most widely debated view with which Dr. Kopf is dealing with in his book, is the view or the model of NIODA, version of NIODA based on bottom-up causation, beginning with quantum level and going up to the micro scale. So the main and the strongest point of criticism, Dr. Kopf mentioned some of them already, but he first refers to the criticism that comes from Alvin Plantinga, where he simply says this: if we want to buy into the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, where we are dealing with inherent indeterminacy of events on a quantum scale, then our knowledge of the physical state of the universe at a given time, T1, let's say, and our knowledge of all the laws of nature does not entail the state of the universe at time T2. Not only our knowledge of it, but even the state of the universe, because there are indeterminate aspects of this universe. Since this renders impossible to specify intervention to begin with, it will be even more difficult for us to understand what non-interventionism would be like, right? Because if the universe is indeterminate in some aspects of it, so how can we discern what intervention outside from the universe would be like? So this is the criticism that is already present, and rightly so, Dr. Kopf brings it in his book. But then comes his strong criticism of this presupposition that he already mentioned a few minutes ago, that this extrinsic intervention would be a violation or at least suspension of the laws of nature. And he criticizes it based on the fact that it is, in one way or the other, a tacit acceptance. It assumes Hume's heavily discussed and criticized account of miracles, which he understands as violation of the laws of nature. And also, as he mentioned, that introduces or presupposes univocal predication of divine and natural causation. This is something that actually Michael Dodds, in his book on titled Unlocking Divine Action, mentions and discusses. Now, what is original for this book that Dr. Kopf presents us with is this classification, a formal classification of NIODA as introducing or assuming, as he mentioned already, a theophysical incompatibilism. So objectively special divine action is incompatible with physical, that is causal determinism, which assumes what he calls in his book a zero-sum perspective. Once again, an effect is caused either by God or by creature, and if it is caused by both, there needs to be a division of labor, which is a Franciscan medieval model with which the Thomistic school disagreed. So this presupposition renders causal indeterminism, as Dr. Kopf mentioned, the condition for the possibility of objective special divine action. Now, there are some conditions under which this indeterminism on the quantum level in this model of NIODA can be a space for divine action, and Dr. Kopf carefully notes those important qualifications of those gaps, and these are important. He says, first of all, they need to be unclosable gaps, which means gaps that are not only an effect of our lack of knowledge, not only epistemological gaps or chance that is only epistemological or epistemologically understood or defined because we don't know true causes, but they are out there. No, it needs to be the case that these gaps are ontological. So they are what he calls in his book breaks in natural order of causation that cannot be closed in principle. This is the first condition or qualification of those gaps. The second one, those the non-interventionist objective divine action in those gaps, it needs to make an objective difference that will be perceived by us. This is the presupposition of a divine action project. And here we have difficulties actually coming from the science of quantum mechanics and difficult questions about the frequency of quantum measurements, and then the question of how often and in how many of those quantum events God would have to intervene such that we could see an objective change in nature on the macro scale. Also because we have, generally speaking in quantum mechanics, there is a difficult question concerning the impact and the translation of micro events on macro events on the macro scale. So this is the second qualification that is difficult and causes a problem and raises difficult questions. But the third one is the most important, most profound, and this is one of the most original aspects of this book, where Dr. Kopf emphasizes that there is a contradiction in this entire approach presented in Divine Action Project and NIODA. Why? Because God's action in quantum events needs to be extrinsic to nature, right? Because if it happens intrinsically in nature, then it is an intervention. So it has to be something that comes from the outside of the fabric of nature, which he calls an extrinsically imposed teleology. Now the problem is that, so according to this understanding or this proposition, those intrinsic causal gaps provide loopholes, as in this Swiss cheese, into which God inserts his agency. And rightly so, Dr. Kopf emphasizes, and I bring a longer quotation because it's crucial. He says that despite the appeal to intrinsic gaps, which are part of the fabric of the universe, those gaps, NIODA is therefore never truly an intrinsic part of nature, which because God has to intervene from the outside of nature, right? Because if he intervenes inside of nature, it is an inside of nature intervention, which we don't want. So there's a contradiction here. NIODA would like to have God who acts in the world, but and therefore those gaps into which he acts, they need to be part of the fabric of the cosmos. It is an ontological aspect of the universe. But then if this is the case, then if he acts on those gaps, then is he intervening in nature or isn't he intervening in nature? So there is a logical contradiction and difficulty here. And this is one of the most acute criticisms and important points in the book. Okay. And then he goes on and he refers to Michael Dodds's crucial point in his book from 2012, where Michael Dodd says that if we look at the interpretations of quantum mechanics, we have two basic camps, we may say. The camp that says, well, there must be hidden variables in nature that we don't know. Read, chance at the quantum level is just epistemological and we need to find out what actually happens there. And the other school that says, no, quantum mechanics proves that there is no causation, no efficient causation at the ground level of the fabric of the cosmos. So Michael Dodd says, well, none of those schools would be happy with NIODA. The first school, which looks for hidden variables, would be unhappy with supernatural cause that fills those natural gaps, whereas the other school would be also unhappy because this is the school that says there is no cause of quantum events, so the idea that there is a cause wouldn't satisfy them at all. So Dr. Kopf brings this argument in his book, and then he also mentions something crucial which is mentioned before by Dodds, but I think it's more clearly stated in Dr. Kopf's book, that, and it is crucial for us coming from Aristotelian Thomistic perspective, that indeterminism, if it is in nature, and if it is true that nature is indeterminate in some aspects of it, indeterminism, he says, lacks the determination but not causation, right? Where only the latter situation would call for inserting some a cause to make things happen. Whereas if we understand that, once again, indeterminism lacks determination, not causation, we could think about a cause that works also through indeterminacy of nature. This is only obviously possible on a broader understanding of causation, which does not limit causation to just efficient causes. So, in other words, if there is no efficient cause of quantum events, it doesn't mean that they are uncaused in general. There may be other causes, formal or teleological aspects of nature that provide for a quasi-causal character of quantum events. Okay. So here, so this is, as I said, I've read the works published by main contributors to this debate, and these are strong points that clearly bring something new into this conversation in terms of criticizing NIODA. And then comes the positive aspect of the book, which is the reframing of Providence. So this is just repetition, but repetition is mater studiorum. This is actually something really original, because where Dr. Kopf says once again that the entire Anglophone theological debate is centered on the notion of causation in reference to human action. And it's actually true that all those who contributed before to this conversation from the Catholic perspective, also Thomistic perspective, we try to bring the retrieval of divine action. So we still, in a way, remain within this entire conversation about divine action, but we want to expand on divine action in a way and bring back the fourfold notion of divine action, which is a game changer in this entire debate. But what is original about this book is that Dr. Kopf reminds us, as he mentioned already, that divine action, divine providence is more than just divine action, because it is defined in terms of the reason or order of things directed to an end, and then the execution of this order, which is divine governance, which most importantly reestablishes the balance in our emphasis on both intellectual and volitional aspects of causal agency of God, which in this entire debate is somehow neglected and sometimes lost. Okay, so and another original aspect of the book, which is new and hasn't been explored before, is this emphasis on or analogy that is being used here to the virtue of prudence, which, as Dr. Kopf mentioned, is always aimed at practical rather than theoretical truth, because this is not a virtue of knowledge, but of providence. Prudence, so it is directed towards action, but it cannot be equated with action, and this is really important. So it includes. So he goes to Aquinas, who actually says that. He says this: that we know in what way providence is set in God is to be seen in what providence is in us, and providence in us before it leads us to a particular action. Prudence, is always the memory of the past, the understanding of the present, and the provision or foresight with respect to the future. So there is a strong intellectual aspect of the virtue of prudence. Therefore, it is a right reason with respect to action, or the habit that enables a person to cognize first the truth about the right action in given circumstances. This is Aquinas, obviously. So the prudential ordinative, or as he calls it, sapiential ordinative view of providence, of divine providence, helps us to rediscover its grounding in God's teleological ordering of the entire cosmos and all creaturely processes to a divinely willed end. And what is crucial for this entire project that Dr. Kopf presents us with is that this teleology works from within and not from without, or not only from without. but basically from within of creation. So that replaces the narrow concept of transeont causation with more general notion of causation, efficacy, or actuality. God is therefore, and then he brings obviously in causation and God working through primary and secondary and instrumental causes. He discusses all this, but this entire schema of divine action in nature is framed within divine providence, understood in reference to the virtue of prudence. And what is crucial, another, I think, most important aspect of the book, which is the heart of the entire project, I would say, is that he then refers to Professor, I should say, Silva, and his retrieval of the notion of divine application of contingent causes. What is divine application of contingent causes? This is in Aquinas, but again, it was somehow forgotten. Silva brings it back, and he emphasizes this, that God not only creates and sustains contingent causes in existence. I think there's an error in the slide, in the way I phrase it. But what is important for Silva, God also applies secondary causes in particular circumstances and uses them as instruments teleologically oriented to him. So this is crucial. We have the language of God creating and sustaining in being, but also applying those causes. And I believe that this is a heart of this entire project, because Dr. Kopf uses this notion of divine application, and he shows in his book that the theory of this divine application of contingent causes is Aquinas' theory of objective special divine action. So there is no need to postulate extrinsic objective divine action, extrinsically imposed teleology, because God, again, not only creates and sustains, but everything that acts in the universe is applied to action specifically by God, okay? So therefore, for him to act in nature in an objective and in a special or specific way, there's no need to search for gaps, even if they are true and they are in the universe, and he works through them. This is not the only one space for divine action, right? And he clearly shows it in his book. So he takes Silva's, I think, argument one step forward in a new way, applying it to a divine action debate. This is my praise of the book. Now, there are a few things that I am critical about, mostly based on my experience of working in this field of science and theology dialogue for a number of years. And having been in touch and conversation with scientists, I can see where they immediately may find difficulties or ask questions, which would be, I think, valid questions. So, Dr. Kopf obviously spends or dedicates entire chapter to teleology, and rightly so. This is an indispensable and foundational aspect of this prudential ordinative notion of divine action. And then he offers us a short overview of the fate of teleology in modernity, I would say, and in contemporary science. And here I think he doesn't spend enough time on it, and he concentrates too much on ways in which some philosophers of biology in 20th century who worked on the 20th century synthesis of evolutionary theory, I specifically think about Ernst Mayr. I will have a quotation in a minute, who thinks that we should redefine teleology and even get rid of the term teleology because it is loaded and it's too ancient and too Aristotelian in a way. So it's true that he does this, but it is not entirely true about the conversation on teleology. Because I would say that a comprehensive account, even a short comprehensive account of teleology debate in the 20th century should begin with actually a positive revival of teleology, which is brought by two other important evolutionary biologists, Teodosius Dobrzański, a Russian and then working in the United States of America. So he carefully says, without naming teleology, that mutation alone uncontrolled by natural selection would result in the breakdown and eventual extinction of life. So indirectly he wants to say that natural selection needs to have some teleological aspect to it. But then we have Francisco Ayala, who had training in classical philosophy, and he openly says, as a biologist, crucial for the 20th century evolutionary synthesis, he says that natural selection is teleological in the sense that it produces and maintains undirected organs and processes. So the entire debate on teleology is complex and vast, and it's true that Dr. Kopf cannot bring this entire debate into this book. This is not the goal of it, but he does refer to evolutionary theory in the last section of the book. Therefore, my criticism would be this: if you engage with evolutionary theory and teleology in evolutionary theory, you should refer to these two thinkers at least, and not just to Ernst Mayr, who in response to Dobrzański and Ayala says that he is much more careful, or I shouldn't say careful, he's skeptical. And he says that teleology, no, but maybe not teleology, but maybe teleonomy, which he defines as a process that owes its goal-directedness to operation of a program. This is the age of first computers, and DNA is discovered, so he in a way sees DNA as a source of some goal-directedness, but he doesn't want to call it teleology. And teleomatics, another term that he proposes as and defines as a process that is end-directed, but based on the laws of nature, without asking a critical question what laws of nature are. So this is just a short reference to the entire debate that I think should be in the book, and not just Mayr, but at least those two other biologists. But there is, with teleology, we have another, slightly critical remark I would like to make. Rightly so, Dr. Kopf studies, and actually this is a very interesting part of the book. I liked it. It's a reminder for me, but it may be new for those who enter this dialogue from different various perspectives. So he dedicates an entire section, or more than just one section, analyzing natural inclinations in things in nature. So he lists natural appetite, sensitive appetite, and rational appetite, after Aquinas, rightly so. But he follows the ancient and medieval classification of nature, which offers us a clear-cut boundaries between those natures. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating clear-cut, but I mean at least much more clear boundaries than we think are there today in reference to contemporary science, where, for example, we have an entire field of biology which works on what is called plant perception or plant sensation, and which is the ability of plants to sense and respond to the environment, adjusting their morphology and physiology. And then we have research on animal consciousness, emotions, and cognition, where, for example, even the contemporary versions or entire debate on the speciation, the human speciation, and also voices coming from Catholic theologians who claim that it might be the case that the last step of speciation of a human being was a step towards a transcendental experience, which means the preceding hominins already were rational, at least to some extent. So those boundaries are not as clear-cut today as they were in the past. So again, I think if we want to invite scientists to read this book, they may be skeptical and they may say, well, you are just following medieval science, so prove to us that you engage with contemporary science as well. But the last and the most, I think, challenging in a way, critical point would refer to another chapter in the book, very well written, on contingency and chance. As you can imagine, it must be one of the chapters here if we speak about indeterminacy of and chance at quantum level. So Dr. Kopf brings the classical understanding of chance, which is a very complex, very interesting, but in this classical understanding of chance, we read in Aquinas after Aristotle that he lists the sources of contingency, or we may say chance in nature. And these are three. First, the conjunction of independent causal chains. So we have causal chains, I don't know, I'm running, he's running, and we meet on the market square. This is a classical example from Aristotle. And the claim is that we have two lines of causality and they intersect, and their intersection was not planned, and therefore we have chance. Another one, the defect of the agent or lack of active causal power. So the active agent may fail in what it or she strives to do, and then we have contingency in nature, or the recipient of action may not be disposed in a proper way. Fine. But the difficulty is here is this. Robert John Russell, and he spends quite some time on it, I'm coming to an end. So he says this. I claim, says Russell, first of all, that point one speaks only about epistemological chance, because we have two lines of causation, and he claims if we can trace back, and if we knew all the initial conditions and all the laws of nature, we would actually explain what happens at this intersection of those two lines of causation. So therefore, he says, nowadays, this is not a chance about which we speak in quantum mechanics. And then he says, therefore he says that what we discover at the quantum level is a completely new type of chance or contingency, which is independent of any causal trajectory, option one in Aristotle and Aquinas, and is not an outcome of or defect or of agent and patient. This is at least what Bob Russell says. Trying to help, because this is one of the most difficult questions, so I'm first challenging you, and I'm trying to be helpful, because I have pondered on it for quite some time, and I talked with Bob Russell, with many people. First of all, we could defend Aquinas, actually, and I think it's profound, where on one, that it is not just epistemological chance. Look what he says in Summa Theologiae, in first part. What results from the clashing of causes is not to be reduced to a further pre-existing cause from which it follows of necessity. So we may say, tracing back those lines of causation. For instance, that some terrestrial body take fire in the higher regions of the air and fall to the earth is caused by some heavenly power. Again, that there be on the surface of the earth some combustible material is reducible to some heavenly principle, right? But the fact that the burning body should alight on this matter and set fire to it is not caused. So he says, you can trace fire back to sun, which is the source of fire. You can trace the combustible material to whatever gives origin to it. But the fact that at this particular moment this material takes on fire can still be considered to be a chance. So maybe you could defend Aquinas in this, at least to this extent. But I think that the question that Russell asks is real. Is it true that we discovered something that Aristotle and Aquinas had no idea about, and this is something completely new? So this is the question to you. And that would be a question asked by Russell. So coming to an end, this is the last slide. There's a lot of speculative analysis in this book, but also Dr. Kopf wants to practically apply his research and the main point that he makes in this research. So if we ask ourselves the question, maybe the smaller question, I mean, I don't know, the more narrow question why we are here tonight, but the bigger question, why are we here as human beings all together? So he applies this entire notion of God working through contingency and teleology in nature to the question of whether the human species is necessary or contingent. So he brings or refers to two two thinkers who started the entire conversation. Stephen Jay Gould, a biological evolutionary biologist who is called in Dr. Kopf's book, the preacher of the gospel of evolutionary contingency. So famously he says, chance is crucial, and if we rewind the tape of life, human beings most likely would not be here because of the contingent nature and the level of contingency of events in nature. And then Simon Conway Morris, another biologist and paleontologist, who says that something completely opposite to it, that nature, if we rewind the tape of life, we most likely will be here because there's a recurrent tendency of biological organization to arrive at the same solutions to similar problems in nature. So what is the answer of Dr. Kopf to this question? You have to go and read the book, at least the final chapters, the final section. So I gave you the summary of all the difficult way that you have to go through all those difficult speculative chapters. The last two chapters, I believe, are on this, so go and read. So coming to an end, so these are short criticisms and critical points that I have, but definitely this is a great read. Congratulations on this book. This comes from Dr. Kopf's doctoral dissertation, and it definitely deserves to be published by Oxford, and this is the beginning of your career in theology, so hopefully we will have many more interesting papers and books coming from you. So thank you very much.